Joe Foyer. I'm the Executive Director of Society for International Development, Washington, D.C. chapter. I want to welcome you all to today's monthly chapter event on the UN Millennium Development Goals, Rhetoric or Reality. Before we get to our events, I want to tell you a little bit about SID-Washington. We are a professional association for all people and organizations involved in development, interested in development, doing development. We're a membership organization. We rely on the participation and the interest and the membership of our members. And if you are not currently a member, we encourage you to join. You can find membership forms outside the door and online at www.SID-W.org. We have a number of exciting events coming this fall. You can find all about them on our website as well. And you can also find a flyer on them again outside the door. I'll just mention one of them right now. We have our annual gala dinner coming up less than 2 months away in early December. We're very pleased to be honoring the Peace Corps in honor of its 50th anniversary, and also honoring the current Peace Corps director, Aaron Williams. He's a longtime member of the development community and a friend of SID's, and we're very pleased that to have the opportunity to honor him. You can we welcome you all to come to our dinner. Again, more information on that online on our website. We're also going to be having a number of going forward member-only networking events. We're responding to our membership requests to have those kinds of events to really give people the opportunity to network among their peers in the community. A couple of words about the events, and then we'll get started. With the recent renewed focus on the Millennium Development Goals at the UN Summit in New York last month, and a renewed commitment to meeting the goals from President Obama in his speech at the summit and in the administration's new global development policy, we wanted to assemble today's panel to really take a hard look at both the successes and the shortcomings of the MDGs in the 10 years since they were announced, as well as look forward to the MDG target date of 2015 and beyond. So I wanted to just thank the people who have been responsible for putting today's panel together and for participating in it. And first of all, I want to thank AED for the use of this gorgeous new facility here at Greeley Hall. I wanted to thank our panelist, Bill Rigler, who came down here from New York, and Charles Kenny, and also thank our moderator and board member, Paul O'Brien. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, thank you for all our hard work in putting this together, our program director, Stacy Whittle. One more bit of housekeeping. I'm asking you all to turn off your phones. It interferes with our video and microphone equipment. Without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Paul O'Brien, who will moderate today's event. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. It's exciting to be here at this time on this topic. Just before I came over here today, I was looking at some blogs, and the last blog I read was a quote from the New York Times where Osama bin Laden was offering us advice on how to solve global problems, and said, if we had just spent more on relief than we had on defense and security, the world would be a different place. And I'm thinking, Osama bin Laden is still out there in the world, and I had been wondering myself what the discussion about global poverty would have been like if 9/11 hadn't happened. A year before 9/11, in September 2000, the largest gathering ever of global leaders, presidents, prime ministers, monarchs, all got together and said, we are going to crack this thing. And they came up with this compact and said, we can do it by 2015 if we don't take our eyes off this ball. And they created the Millennium Development Goals. And we've had the decade we've had ever since. There have been some great successes, we all know that. We're going to talk about that today, but there's also been some now predictable stories about how we're not going to make it by 2015. So, we think it's a great time to have a debate. Are the MDGs still useful? Are they still meaningful in this day and age? Should we still be focusing on them as a vehicle for achieving our global poverty goals, or are they now stale and no longer capable of bringing global leaders together around a common purpose? And towards that end, we have a great panel with hopefully some very different views on this question. And I'm going to introduce them to you and give you a sense of why they might have different views, and ask you to think about questions that might engage us in an interesting debate. Our format today is not to give you long presentations and sort of recount in great depth and detail our different perspectives, but to have the two panelists share some preliminary views with you, I think about 5 minutes or so, and then engage in a discussion, both me with them and you with them. So I'll ask a few questions and then I'll open it up to you, and I think we're going to be done by 2. So let me introduce the two panelists, and I think you'll get a sense of why they bring such interesting but different perspectives to the questions that we're going to be asking around the MDGs. Bill Rigler here, immediately to my left, is the Director of Communications at Millennium Promise. Now let me read to you the mission statement of Millennium Promise, and you'll get a sense of where he might be coming from. Millennium Promise is the leading international non-profit organization solely committed to supporting the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals to have extreme poverty by 2015.
Halve.
That's the Irish. I think we're to get pretty close to. Millennium Promise oversees the Millennium Villages project, which supports integrated social and business development services for more than 500,000 people in rural communities across 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But Bill, interestingly, and as you think of your questions, Bill comes to this with a really interesting array of experiences that you might want to keep in mind. I think you'll find he understands the perspectives of the private donor. He was the chief of staff for the Rockefeller Foundation. I think you'll find that he understands the private sector. He was the deputy managing director at Global Consulting Group, which provided advice to corporations. He has a lot of on-the-ground experience. He, at one point, headed the fabulously named Humpty Dumpty Institute, which has a very serious mission to forge public-private partnerships to address humanitarian concerns. And I think there was a heavy focus on landmines, and still is. He understands multilaterals and how they come to this discussion. He was a senior advisor, I think the advisor to the CEO at UNOPS. And importantly, in this town, he understands how politics works and how it doesn't work. He was at one point the chief of staff to vice presidential candidate Geraldine Ferraro. So he will bring a lot of acumen to that issue, but I do think fundamentally he now is a senior figure in an organization that is profoundly invested in the MDGs and their success. Charles Kenny brings a slightly different perspective. An article I think is as good a piece I've seen written about the MDGs is entitled "The Trouble with the MDGs," and then subtitle. He has thought as deeply about the MDGs and their achievability as many. I think you're an economist really by background, although I think what he seriously is a serious self-effacing person, because every time I tried to give him a compliment as we were warming up, he said, "Ooh, I wouldn't be that flattering." He is about to be a senior fellow at CGD and a Schwartz Fellow at the New America Foundation. He's written a lot about economic growth, which, by the way, I hope you all read the President's speech just before the summit. Economic growth and its power to lift people out of poverty as the vehicle is the discussion in Washington now, or at least one of the main discussions. Charles has written and thought about whether that's a serious question and what are the strengths and shortcomings of that question. He's a contributing editor at Foreign Policy magazine and has also had a lot of experience in the real world managing investment projects and technical assistance projects in places like Afghanistan and Kenya, both near and dear to my heart. So you have a great blend with very different views on the MDGs from our two speakers, and I think it should be an interesting discussion. So that's the groundwork. So let's see if we can provoke both a little bit of depth of discussion, and perhaps I hope you feel free to take very different perspectives from each other. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions. The viability of the MDGs as the target for focusing international attention on poverty reduction. You heard my sort of intro comments. We've had a decade in which the world may have been taking its eye off poverty reduction as an end in itself. And you start seeing more and more actors seeing poverty reduction or development as a really important tool towards other ends, maybe security ends, maybe diplomatic ends. But have we had, over the last 10 years, a serious discussion about poverty reduction as an end in itself? Well, are the MDGs most valuable as a target to refocus all of us on poverty reduction as an end in itself, or as a set of tools to help us think about how to achieve those targets? And because Charles wrote an article that said, I read it to say, they may be more effective as a set of tools, I'll throw that question first to you, and then I'll ask Bill if he agrees or if he takes a different perspective. So, are they really important as a set of targets, or more useful as a set of tools?
I'd say the Millennium Development Goals are really important, and I think one of the reasons they're really important, one of the things that is incredibly valuable about them, is that they say development is not just about money. The focus just on GDP per capita growth, which was sort of the be-all and end-all, if you will, at least in certain minds of development. The MDGs broke that idea down, and I think that was incredibly valuable. And the reason I think it's incredibly valuable, to take a simple example, between 1960 and 2005, World Bank data suggests there were 12 countries that saw GDP per capita declines over that period. There were undoubtedly more than 12 countries, but there are 12 on which we have decent data. So in those 12 countries, income per capita fell by an average of 25%. These countries got considerably poorer, and by the way, they were all poor to start off with. In those same countries, life expectancy went up 10 years over that period. Literacy rates doubled. We know it wasn't more money that did it. These countries were getting poorer. It was something else. It suggests there's a lot more to the story of development than more money. And the MDGs, because it goes beyond MDG 1, and indeed MDG 1 has nutrition in there as well.
Can you say what MDG 1 is?
Sorry, MDG 1 is the halving poverty development goal, the most famous one, if you will. But it is also, I'm happy to stand corrected, the goal on nutrition. And then there's MDG 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, covering health and education and global collaboration. These things are different, they matter on their own grounds, and it's important that we think about it. So that's the way that I love the MDGs. But the thing is that the fact that it's not all about money is also important. It's about policy and institutions and the demand side of development. Persuading parents they really need to send their kids to school, for example. Persuading parents they really need to vaccinate their kids. There's this demand side story which is, I think, pretty central to development, which really isn't about more money. Not that money doesn't help, money helps, but it's about a lot more than money. It also suggests that there's a sort of a limit to the rate of progress that you can expect to see in changes in literacy, or changes in infant mortality, or changes in child mortality. If you look across countries, there are strong global patterns to how fast these things change. They're all improving. They're improving globally. As I said, they're improving in a whole bunch of countries that have seen absolutely no economic growth. We are seeing worldwide, pretty much everywhere, dramatic, historically unprecedented improvements in health and education. But it's not, again, necessarily, or maybe even primarily about the money. It's about a bunch of other things, including policy, institutions, and demand side. That leads to some problems with global goals like, by 2015 we must have 100% of kids in primary education. Completed primary education? Full course of primary education. Because, however much money you throw at the problem, there's this demand side issue with education. Dion Filmer in the World Bank a few years ago did a study that showed that he took a number of poor developing countries and looked at where the schools were in those countries and asked, is it that there aren't schools nearby villages that are stopping kids going to school? And the answer to that question was, if you built a school right next door to every household in the developing world, I mean, a nutty idea, right? But just imagine you tried it. The average primary enrollment rate in those countries would go from 50% to 53%. The other 47% of kids still wouldn't be in school. It wasn't the fact that there wasn't a school next door that was stopping them going to school. It wasn't the supply side. It was a demand side issue. It was that parents just didn't think it was the most important thing they could do with their kid, send that kid to school. Demand side changes take a while. Changing people's opinions is not something that happens overnight. And it's, again, about a lot more than money. So here's where my problem with the MDGs is. Take the goal of 100% of kids completing primary education by 2050. There are countries in Africa that have, over the last 20 years, achieved, again, historically unprecedented increases in primary enrollment levels. And they're up to 50%. They'll never get to 100% by 2015. They have done something that is massively impressive, and they are about to be labelled an MDG failure. And I think that's the problem. Now, it's not actually a problem with the original goals, the UN summit in 2000, because the original goal was a global goal. Actually, obviously, with 100% primary education, it doesn't matter if it's a global goal or a country goal. Every country's got to meet it. But for the other goals, it really does matter. It was a global goal, not a country goal. But they've been interpreted very widely by the World Bank, by the UN, by development organizations around the world as being country goals. And so if you as a country fail to get to 100% primary enrollment, you're going to be labelled a failure, even if you have managed somehow to stuff more kids faster into school than anybody else has managed in history. And that seems to me a real shame. And so that's where I think MDGs as a tool, a way of thinking about development are really valuable, because they broaden the debate, and the debate so needed to be broadened. My worry is that the targets, the individual targets, really don't work for all countries, and we're setting ourselves up for failure. We have seen over the last 50 or 60 years unprecedented improvements around the world in countries rich and poor in health and education. That progress continues, not as fast as it should, but that progress continues. Despite that, we're about to say the development industry is a failure. It didn't manage to do the MDGs. African governments, they're all useless. They didn't manage to get to the MDG targets. This is a real shame. We are taking honest-to-goodness success stories, and there is fear that we're turning them into failures.
Okay, well that's a great opening. Bill, over to you, and feel free to share sort of broad thoughts to get us started.
Sure.
But I mean, Charles has laid out some very interesting challenges. They're flawed in that they're supply-sided, not demand-sided. They're not useful as targets because they turn what could be viewed as great successes into coming up short.
Great.
What do you think?
Well, I think it's going to be a fun debate. I'm enjoying this. First of all, thank you very much, Paul, and the organizers, SID-Washington, and Charles. Congratulations on your new baby. It's 2 weeks old. So, I think it's easy to forget how far we've come in 5 years, and I think that's a really useful starting point. When the MDGs were first articulated as a series of targets and goals 5 years ago, we had an American ambassador at the United Nations 24 hours before the summit concluded, was actively lobbying to get the language of the Millennium Development Goals stripped from the final document. We had a government at the time that absolutely refused, for legal reasons and for others, to have any reference to Millennium Development Goals in any documents at the State Department. We had a number of critics and skeptics who were just openly hostile to the idea of having any sort of global framework for development. 5 years later, now, we have a much different ballpark. It's a much different picture. Paul was very kind to point out a great article that Charles wrote 6 years ago, forecasting the many inherent challenges with the MDGs. I would actually point you to my second favorite article that Charles wrote that came out in the September-October issue of Foreign Policy this year, entitled Best Decade Ever. And I don't think it's a mistake that the MDGs played a galvanizing role in helping to focus the world's attention on a series of systems issues that previously had never received any sort of attention whatsoever. I think the most useful thing that the MDGs did was that they removed the series of false choices that are inherent in development activities. Charles gives a very, very good example about education and points out that it's very demand-driven in the sense that if you build a school, does that mean that they'll necessarily have more children in school? The answer, of course, is not. But this is where the MDGs and the practicality of the approach that the MDGs espouses is so right on target. It removes the false choices, and then it also recognizes, are kids not going to school because they lack access to a school? Or are they going to school because they have malaria? Are they not going to school because they don't have enough food? Are they not going to school because they have to walk 3 hours each way to get clean drinking water? And so the idea that people have to choose between education, between health, between nutrition, is like asking you, well, which organ would you prefer, your brain, your heart, or your lungs? So what the MDGs then have done is that they have removed this false sense of competition among priorities and systems. I'll stop there because I know that we've got a bunch of other questions, but let's be very clear here that the MDGs are goals. They're not anything more than that. They're a way to organize the world community, governments, and individuals toward a target in 2015 that can be met.
Okay, that's a great opening from your side. Thanks. And I'm going to come straight back to you. So,
Great.
Let's take everything you say on, assume it's true. They're goals, and that's a great value. Some would now say that as goals, they have lost their political mobilizing capacity. Glen Eagles 2005, we saw that level of additional investment. This year, some would say the fact that the president made a speech and talked about the MDGs, but didn't put new numbers on there, that the rise of what people call the BRICS or BRICSAMs is changing the global equation and who should be speaking about these goals since then, as a tool to cohere a global development discussion. Are they still sufficiently vibrant to mobilize another decade of engagement, or and perhaps putting on your political hat here, or are they starting to be stale and in need of an injection of something different? And are you going to see politicians increasingly look for a new vehicle?
The answer to the first question is absolutely yes. 10 years ago when the Millennium Declaration was made, there were world leaders who signed on to the Millennium Declaration. I'm sure that many of them at the time thought that it was an issue that would go away. The fact that 1 month from yesterday, we had over 140 world leaders coming back to New York to reaffirm a commitment that had been made 10 years earlier, I think is a very, very strong testament to the fact that the MDGs have political saliency, they resonate, and above all, there has been enough successes in meeting the MDGs to justify that reaffirmation of the principles. That said, what the next 5 years will absolutely require is an acknowledgement of where the successes have been made, and also a very frank discussion and understanding about where the gaps are. What's the reason for those gaps, and what needs to be done very rapidly to scale up the successes in areas where the gaps persist. I think it's particularly interesting when you mentioned Glen Eagles. There are commitments that were made 5 years ago at the G8 that basically called for, right now, the G8 countries to be giving approximately $60 billion a year to Africa. That's not a lot of money. Many of those commitments have been made. So far, I think the current figure is around $45 billion. Very much off track. But that number, in effect, equates to the 0.7 GDP target that we in the development community have been talking about for years and years and years. Now, I think that there are two important things here to recognize. That gap of $15 billion is the equivalent of what one Wall Street firm paid last year in bonuses. I mean, the relativity of it all is pretty shocking. The second issue that I would make with the fact that there's a $15 billion shortfall is that were it not for the very existence of the MDGs, there likely would not have been even any commitment to Glen Eagles toward poverty in Africa at all. So, it's very much a glass half full, glass half empty approach. The last point that I would make, and I think that this is particularly constructive if you've been following what's been going on with Prime Minister Cameron's cabinet. They are in the process of cutting several hundred billion quid from their budgets in order to balance their budgets. In spite of all of this, in spite of putting pensioners out of work, in spite of cutting public service programs, they have decided that they are not going to balance their budget on the backs of the world's poor, and they have obligated themselves publicly to meeting the 0.7% commitment. Now, if Britain's going to do it, then shouldn't all the other G8 countries do it? I will say, just as a final footnote, the US government has been spectacular. What's very much needed, though, is that the US really needs to work very closely in dealing with a lot of the recalcitrant members of the G8, like Italy, which has basically completely shut down its aid programs, France, Germany. These are the countries that, if they really are to, sorry, let me start over. It's critical that they meet the commitments that have already been made. And I think that the most important thing with the MDGs is that we're not asking for new money. We're asking for the commitments that have been made to be fulfilled.
That's great. I'm going to come back to you on why you think the US government has been so spectacular in another question. But Charles, do you agree? You don't claim to wear a deeply sophisticated political Washington hat, but you've been engaged in debate around the MDGs and their viability for some time. Do you think they still have the kind of cachet as a mobilizing instrument? Do you find in the circles that you're working in that they are still the center of a vibrant debate and have a bit of longevity?
Actually, yes. I mean, I should say more broadly, and sorry for the point of view of the debate, I think I agree pretty much with everything Bill said so far.
That won't do it all. Yeah, sorry.
Bad news.
But
say something really obnoxious.
my concern is, going forward, there's going to have to be an accounting, right? Going forward, we're going to hit this moment, 2015, when we fail to meet a lot of the goals. A lot of countries fail to meet a lot of the goals, and in particular, a lot of countries that get a lot of aid fail to meet a lot of the goals. And I think that's a real worry. I don't actually think it takes. Sorry to sort of go technical, but there's a difference between the goals and the targets, right? The goals are the kind of headlines, and the targets are the individual percentages. I think the mistake that was made, it's a bit late to do anything about it now, but the mistake that was made was that percentages were set without too much thought, or at least perhaps with the wrong sort of thought, with political hats on rather than overly political hats on, rather than sort of technically feasible hats on, if you will. And going forward, it's not that we should abandon the MDGs in 2015 and go back to thinking it's just income per capita that matters. What we really ought to do is try a new approach to come up with targets that are stretch targets, because surely that is an important part of the MDGs. They weren't meant to say, right, well, we want to continue progress as usual. They're meant to be a motivating force for more change, and surely we can change faster. But setting targets that, while they're stretch targets, really are reasonable at the country level. Because even if you set them globally and you say, no, they're just global, they're going to be applied at the country level. So if for MDG 2, what we could do is keep broadly the same goals, maybe add one or two, maybe think about education quality as well as education extent, for example. But more importantly, perhaps, think about targets, individual percentages that actually make sense at the country level as stretch targets, but realistic targets. We might, in, I guess, 2030, come up with a situation where we raise the money, from the development community side, we've done what we can on our side, and countries where the real action is at have done the great majority of the work at making progress towards these goals. And the world as a whole has met the targets, and the great majority of countries, including those that get lots of aid, have made the targets. And then I think we'll be in a much happier position in 2031.
Okay, so realism and humility. Well, I'm going to push you a little bit on that and then ask Bill to respond. I think it's certainly the flavor of the moment, considering where we are, to be humble about what's achievable. But I think it's fair to say that one of the mobilizing sentiments behind the MDGs, and it was echoed by a fellow countryman of mine who sings and has forgotten his last name, was we have enough money for the first time in history. We have enough wealth to feed everyone, to educate everyone. We're not trying hard enough. We're just not. We're distracted by other short-term goals, by narrow self-interest instead of enlightened self-interest. There isn't enough global leadership to motivate us to actually get our heads around a common set of goals and work at it. That's what Bono was saying, it's what everybody else was saying at the time. And there's I think for many of us who work in development, there's still a resonance of truth in that. We're not trying hard enough. And as good as, I'd be interested to hear your views, but as good as the US may be doing on some fronts, we spend 1 in 4 of every global aid dollar here in terms of official development assistance. We're nowhere near 0.7. So there is this question, is it really just that we haven't even begun to put the right level of resourcing towards achieving the Millennium Development Goals, that we've never actually given that argument a chance? And the way I read your comments today and what you've written, you sort of seem to think the value of the MDGs is not about getting more funding out of donors, because I think what you said is development doesn't really happen that way. So correct me if I'm wrong or putting words in your mouth, and then it'd be interesting to hear Bill's views.
We rich countries are not doing nearly enough to help the developing world in the story. It goes way beyond more aid dollars. There ought to be larger flows of migration, and there ought to be much freer trade. Something that your fellow countryman has been picking up on recently. Absolutely with. I think that's a slightly separate question. Separate question from is lack of aid what has stood between the world and meeting the MDGs? My answer to that would be no. That for many countries in Africa, which are already getting 50% of their government budgets from aid, there's only so much more aid you can throw before there's a declining return. That it's not about the money. It is about the money, but it's also about a lot of other things. It's about institutions and policies and the demand side and so on and so forth. And so, again, it comes back to humility. We in the developed world should be doing more, and one simple reason we should be doing more is we don't know the extra benefit of the final dollar on the average US income to the happiness and well-being of a US kid. Buying that second flat screen TV doesn't really amount to much when it comes to basic quality of life. That dollar spent in Kenya is far more likely to have an impact on something about basic quality of life. So move that dollar from the United States to Kenya, please do, and it will help. It won't get us all the way, is I guess what I'm saying. Be realistic, be humble about what we, sitting in Washington and sitting in London, sitting in New York, can achieve. This is really something that has to be driven by developing countries and by the people in developing countries.
Well, what do you think?
I respectfully disagree.
Great. I knew we'd get there.
Everything is true up to a point, and if I may just bring it back to the MDGs, this again I think is where the MDGs have played such a crucial role in development. They have organized our thinking in ways that previously hadn't been done. They've broken us out of a silo approach. When I say us, it's the royal we. Broken us out of a silo approach and made us understand that what's more important is to look at things in a proper systems approach. 5 years ago, right before the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, there had never been any effort like this whatsoever, where you've got a pool that, through a systems approach, through collecting money from various governments and spreading money around technologies, resources, people, that had never been done before. And I think the metrics, in the case of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, are really illustrative here. 10 years ago, not one person in sub-Saharan Africa was on AIDS medication. And the rationale used at the time was that sub-Saharan Africans are too poor, they don't know how to tell time, and the drugs won't matter. Well, fast forward to today, where we've got over 10 million people in sub-Saharan Africa on antiretrovirals. The only reason, that's a bold statement. One of the single largest reasons why you've got so many people on antiretrovirals in sub-Saharan Africa right now is because of the Global Fund. The reason why you have the Global Fund is that you had the Millennium Development Goals initiate the thinking into these sorts of systems approaches. So while aid and trade is crucial, what's also important though is that let's take that same logic that the MDGs forced us to really start looking at systems and use that to have a much more profound introspective look at aid as a whole. So throwing money at a problem is absolutely not the way to go. And I don't think anybody here would dispute that. What is important is to make aid smarter. And I think this is in particular where the Center on Global Development has played such a crucial role. You had indicated earlier that some of the targets might have been thrown out a little with not so much intellectual rigor. I dispute that first because my boss headed up that program, but also your boss was one of the key task force members on the UN Millennium Project that defined what those targets are. It was a 3-year-long program made up of 300 global experts who sliced and diced every single aspect of extreme poverty. The MDGs in that case clearly don't go far enough. For example, access to secondary education is nowhere to be seen in the MDGs. But the thinking at the time was that let's start slow and expand up. Let's meet the most basic indicators of extreme poverty, and then we'll go from there. So if I may just very circuitously circle back to the original point, the idea with the MDGs, again, is it's focusing our thinking on a systems approach. It's focusing our thinking on a much more practical and useful and high ROI thinking about how aid can and should be used. And the most important thing is that the MDGs aren't the goals that have been set by people in Washington, people in New York. There are national capitals, communities, individuals, and corporations, each of whom have a co-equal stake in making sure that the MDGs are achieved. There have been dozens and dozens of countries in Africa over the last 3 years that have all created national strategies to achieve the MDGs. Some will reach targets. In the case of Tanzania, which 5 years ago had only 50% of its primary school population in school, today has close to 100%. The fact that the MDGs as a target have existed and have served as an action forcing mechanism for these countries and for these communities to take action in their own hands and to create national strategies that have been appropriately financed.
That's great. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this question about why you use the word spectacular in describing the U.S. government, and I want to set it up in this way. So I work for Oxfam, and in 6 or 7 years ago, if Oxfam collectively, we work in 17 of the G20 countries, if we wanted to move the MDG debate forward, we focused pretty much exclusively on Europe, where a lot of the debate was really taking off in different ways. And the feeling about where the debate was in the United States was, it's a different debate, it's dominated by the security paradigm right now, it's not really, I mean there was some good progress on a couple of fronts, but it's not the place to try and build a global consensus around what you're trying to do to fight poverty. That was sort of the assessment we did. It's a very different assessment today, and it's partly because politics has changed in Europe. The economic crisis is deeply affecting Europe, and so I listen to my colleagues and they're not that optimistic about how the European leaders are going to approach the MDG debate. And at the same time, they're increasingly optimistic about where the US is on this discussion, that it may be a time in which, and this isn't simply about Democratic versus Republican politics, they feel that for a range of reasons, the United States may be well positioned to lead a global debate around whether the MDGs are still achievable, and if there needs to be a new vehicle, what might it be, and perhaps even in the person of the president, they may have a spokesperson for that agenda. So that's sort of the context in which I asked the question, but you said you think the US government is spectacular at a time when it still, as a percentage of GDP, is not a great performer. What did you mean?
Good one. Again, I think it's easy to forget how far we've come in such a short period. I first got my start in Washington, forgive me for dating myself, in 1997, and it was fun for me to walk in and see a colleague here whom I used to work with. 1997, most people may not remember, was actually the low water mark for U.S. foreign assistance. It's something that's easy to forget. You don't think that instinctively you wouldn't think that President Clinton was responsible for such a low foreign aid budget, but he was. And there were other vectors, of course, but it happened on his watch. When President Bush came in, he created PEPFAR, the President's Malaria Initiative. He drastically increased funding for HIV/AIDS, foreign assistance. He created the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Now you've got President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and Administrator Shah, who have created the Smallholder Agriculture Fund. They've created the Feed the Future initiative. they have focused like a laser on agriculture in a way that, frankly, in Africa has been forgotten for about the last 25 years. I'm not suggesting that a lot more doesn't need to be done, but relative to where we've come from, I think it's a dramatic leap. That said, there are holes in the administration's approach, and I think it's important to understand this. The first and foremost is the issue of optics related to the MDGs. It's very, very difficult for the president to mobilize people behind his agenda when he's only been to sub-Saharan Africa once as a president. When he, for the most part, and as far as I can tell, and I've done a little bit of research on this, has only publicly made reference to the Millennium Development Goals on 3 occasions. It's kind of difficult to sell the public on an agenda if you're not willing to repeat it publicly. The other issue that I would make on this is that, I'll stop there actually. So.
Okay. Charles, I detect from your accent that you may at the very least have spent time in the European context. What do you think about a story that perhaps the center of energy now towards the achievement of the MDGs as far as stimulating global debate has moved across the Atlantic in this way, at least for a period, and that if you're trying to move things both in terms of thinking and politics, this might be an environment in which to do so?
Surely it helps that President Obama is considerably more popular in Europe than his predecessor was, and so it's more plausible to imagine that Europe would take the United States seriously on this. Having said that, I think the point you made about money is a relevant one, at least until recently. I think it's still the case. The UK was the largest donor to the International Development Agency, for example, not the US, despite the fact, obviously, the UK economy is a lot smaller. The US has sort of some way to go to pay its dues in terms of international organisations, in particular the UN as well. Before I think it, sort of can stand and say yes, we really lead on this issue, and I would strongly welcome the United States stepping up to the plate on that. I think it would be a great thing.
Okay, and I think it will be an interesting discussion to talk about how much of UK funding went through IDA as opposed to the US model, which tends, while supporting IDA, to be more bilaterally focused. But I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to throw it open to all of you. So I hope you have your questions at the ready. And just following a little bit on what we've been talking about, President Obama's speech, the way I parse it, is that he said, we need some development success stories. We've been at this for too long, and the time has come to prove that some of this learning we've done actually works. And the way that we are going to achieve success is we're going to focus on a much smaller number of countries, and we're going to focus like a laser beam on economic growth. That's going to be our measure of success in a small number of countries. Now, if you're parsing that and you're sitting in this climate, you know that the Afghanistans and the Pakistans and to some extent the Iraqs are still going to get a lot of attention. And you know that there's going to be a highly selective process of picking those success stories because not a lot of developing countries out there have the governments of Finland and so on. So we're going to be talking about maybe a half dozen countries that we think might achieve economic growth. But if you care profoundly about the MDGs and having global poverty, you've got an awful lot of countries in the middle. And so what happens to them? So my question here is, you've thought about economic growth, Charles. I'll go first to you and the MDG impact on economic growth. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that we are now using economic growth more as a lens for understanding how poverty gets reduced? And what do you think about this idea of focusing on areas where economic growth can be achieved? And I'll come to you on what your concerns are about that.
First of all, if your goal is to reduce income poverty, you need economic growth. Simple as that. The statistical evidence on that is just overwhelming. So I don't think there's any question that if your goal, and your only goal, is to reduce income poverty, you need economic growth. Especially in Africa, especially in poorer countries. Having said that, and I come back to sort of what I opened with, I think that's a real shame because I think it's a very narrow approach. So I think it's a real shame from 2 points of view. One, it's a narrow approach. Actually, you can improve quality of lives without improving income. And frankly, aid has got a better record at improving quality of life than it does of improving income. So, for example, aid played a huge role in the global eradication of smallpox. Just an undoubted success of aid. I mean, it took a lot of other things apart from aid, but aid was a really important part of that process. The fact that polio is now, we hope, on the verge of extinction, again, aid has played a really important role there. No question about it. Had a massive impact on the quality of life. When it comes to income growth, well, studies abound about whether there is a relationship between aid and income growth across countries, and I think probably the fair conclusion is, well, it depends maybe sometimes. It's not nearly such a compelling story as the stories that we have when it comes to health and education, maternal mortality. I think there are really strong cases there for where aid has really obviously made a massive difference. So I think it's a shame because it's a narrow focus and maybe a hard one for aid to do something about. And also, if I may tread on territory where I'm not an expert, so feel free to shoot me down. I'm not sure it's where USAID, for example, has its comparative advantage. As I understand it, USAID faces quite a number of hurdles that it has to jump through every time because of heavy congressional involvement in how it operates. People in USAID suffer under a lot of constraints and burdens. Partially because the idea of just sort of handing over budget support to a country, for example, goes against everything Congress stands for. So it may be that USAID ought to be trying another approach to help countries that isn't the standard model for aid. I mentioned earlier that I think the demand side is hugely important for development. So changing people's opinions about what is important, sending kids to school, getting them vaccinated, that kind of thing. I'd also say the technologies involved are terribly important. You can't eradicate polio without polio vaccine. You can't eradicate smallpox without a smallpox vaccine. So technology really matters to some of these quality of life things. Now, the United States has a comparative advantage in technology. It has a lot of scientists doing a lot of fascinating work. It has a comparative advantage, I would argue, in marketing. Madison Avenue is, kind of big. These are areas where the United States actually might be able to play a leadership role, playing to its natural strengths. I've mentioned one other, and that's evaluation. MIT is home to some of the best thinking on evaluation in the planet. Randomization, and I don't want to get into the technical arguments here, randomization is not the be-all and end-all of a successful evaluation program, but there's a lot of really good thinking in this country about how to work out what works in development. And I think if the United States could support more of that work in development, well, they'd be doing a huge favour to everybody. So maybe rather than trying to tackle a problem which is difficult to tackle with aid in general, maybe misses what aid can do best, especially if it comes from USAID, and doesn't necessarily play to US strengths, and move towards a model that may do better at that would have a big impact. And I think that Administrator Shah and Hillary Clinton have both made speeches recently, for example, on the importance of science and technology in development, which suggests I may be preaching to the choir. But
I'm going to ask you the same question, but I'm going to add something on this because I think it'd be useful for folks to hear your thoughts on this, and there may provoke other questions. The Millennium Villages project. It's now reaching 500,000 people, right? A premise of the Millennium Villages project is that we can't just be piloting small ideas if we are really going to get what Jeff Sachs called the end of poverty. He's a co-founder of this initiative, right? He said, you've got to be able to do a set of holistic interventions pretty much everywhere that you need to be able to do it. That's what you've got to work towards. And with a relatively small amount of investment, you could actually see massive change. And so, a place which you've written about and been to, Saori, if you could get enough different types of investments, village over time could be transformed. That's not congruent with the way I framed the president's speech about focusing on small number of countries which have proven governance models, need to be demonstrated at the macroeconomic level as success stories. That's a very different idea. So my question to you at some level is, what do you think of that? And is the Millennium Villages project under threat if global development discussions start to focus much more narrowly on finding successes first and cultivating them?
If the measure of support is defined as success, then I'm not worried about support for the Millennium Villages project. That's a very bold statement, and I hope that you'll forgive me for being so daft. But the truth of the matter is that 5 years ago, when the Millennium Villages project was started, it was grounded in science that was bolstered by some of the finest scientists in the world, based out of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. It was done in cooperation with local communities, with national governments, and with policymakers. The idea behind the Millennium Villages project, and forgive me again for evangelizing here, the idea behind the Millennium Villages project is that with a low dollar series of proven interventions, we can reduce poverty, we can achieve the MDGs, and we can do it in a sustainable and a scalable way. The other vector added on to the Millennium Villages project is that of the 14 sites that exist in 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they were deliberately placed in the hardest places in the world in which to achieve the MDGs. So 5 years later, the metrics that we've seen, I think in my mind are pretty astounding. We've seen a 3-fold increase in food production. We've seen malaria prevalence reduced by 7-fold. We've seen access to clean drinking water increase from 20% to 72%. We've seen mobile phones increase. I want to make a few critical distinctions here when talking about the Millennium Villages. One is that we have never said that the Millennium Villages are the path. We've said it's a path. Remember that when the Millennium Villages were started, nobody else was doing this. So we've actually seen a number of other similar initiatives that have started that have all bought into the idea of an integrated approach to development. And it's great. This is the conversation that we should be having. These are the sorts of activities that should be happening. We love the fact that we've got companies like Ericsson, for example, who have become engaged not only with us, but all throughout sub-Saharan Africa. An interesting sidebar is that a couple of weeks ago I was speaking with the CEO of Ericsson. He was mentioning that they have actually misjudged the cell phone ownership in sub-Saharan Africa by over 1 billion users. So if the leading mobile phone company in the world misjudges the market for mobile phones in Africa by not an insignificant rounding error, that's big, right? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. So, when we talk about the successes, I think it's really important to kind of unpack what it is that we're talking about when we talk about successes. One of the small successes that we've had in the Millennium Villages that's being replicated all throughout sub-Saharan Africa is the notion of a community health worker. I met a community health worker when I was in Kenya. This guy was 36 years old. He had 7 children. He had a 3rd grade education. He received 2 months of training to be a community health worker. He had a bag full of antiretrovirals, malaria test kits, and he had a cell phone, and he had a bicycle. In any given week, he was able to visit 200 homes. He was able to do a pinprick blood test for anti-malaria, diagnose it on the spot, hand medicines to the people, and then send a text message to a national registry that had been set up that first of all monitors and tracks those figures, but also contributes to a broader understanding of e-health, m-health, and very, very low cost solution to what for centuries has been a huge crippling factor in Africa's growth and development. Now, if we can take somebody with a 3rd grade education and give them a phone, and give them a backpack with medicines, and give them a bicycle, and if they are in effect the front line against killing off malaria in Africa, think of what else we're doing with piped water, or what we're doing with long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets, or increased fertilizer or food. There's one other success story that I don't think that gets nearly enough attention. It's within the context of economic growth, so I hope that you'll forgive me for just spouting for just 1 minute. 3 years ago, in the midst of the global economic crisis, President Rhetoric of Malawi made a very determined decision that he was going to restructure his debt relief financing, and he was going to start a subsidy program where every single rural farmer in Malawi was given a bag of fertilizer. Now, the results have been phenomenal. Malawi, over the last 3 years, has seen sustained economic growth of around 7 to 8%. they've tripled their food yields from approximately 1 ton per hectare to over 3 tons per hectare, and it's no longer a food-dependent country. Interventions like a bag of fertilizer or a cell phone are successes that deserve our support. They're successes that deserve the support of corporations, of individuals, and of governments. So if the idea is that we want to merchandise successes and scale them up, there's no better model than to look at what's being done on the ground and to kind of rethink how it is that, what do we consider success. The last point that I just want to make, I want to pimp out CGD just a little bit. They have a fantastic report on MDGs global scorecards that I would highly recommend that everyone check out.
And I think they have an upcoming paper on the Millennium Villages coming too.
As luck would have it, yeah.
As luck would have it.
I'm Lindsay Whitmore from Making Sense International. And I'm wondering if these health and education investments that the U.S. is currently really good at, is it resulting in economic growth? Why isn't it resulting in economic growth? And what do you do to get economic growth if not making investments there?
Great question. Great question. I think we'll take them one at a time. Do
I'll let
either
the
of you feel
economist
moved
answer that,
to
if that's all right.
answer that one? And I'll opine, being an amateur in this area as well. Go ahead, Charles. What do you think?
This one's harder to work out than it should be, right? I mean, on one level, it's blooming obvious that if you're ill and illiterate, you're not going to earn as much as somebody who's healthy and literate. So it ought to be one of these things that just pops out in the data. The funny thing is that we know sort of two big things about the world. One is that GDP growth has happened a lot in some places and not very much in others. And the other is that health and education has improved almost everywhere and dramatically over the last 60 years. Now, that means two things. One, the point I was making earlier, that there's a lot more to health and education improvements than just more money. But the other thing it means is education and health improvements, at least sort of immediately, can't be paying off in terms of larger GDP per capita. Because a lot of countries have gone from close to zero primary enrollment to close to 100% primary enrollment and remain very, very, very poor. A lot of countries have seen life expectancy increase 20 years and much less morbidity as a result, and related to that. And they're not hugely richer. I think it does speak to the fact that probably the institutional story of GDP per capita growth is the right one, that it's about legal regimes and quality of governance and so on and so forth. Now, I believe as a matter of faith rather than as something that at least I'm comfortable with the statistics on, but I believe as a matter of faith that surely having an educated population is an important constituent part of building quality institutions, which will lead to economic growth. But clearly this is a very long-term story, and that's why you don't pick it up immediately in the data.
That's great. I'll just very briefly say Oxfam's written a mind-numbing, the book isn't mind-numbing, but that it's 500 pages long is mind-numbing book, which you can get on Amazon, called From Poverty to Power. And the premise of the book is that you want to achieve sustainable economic growth over time, you have to have an effective state, an active citizenry that can hold that state accountable. And you won't see citizens being truly active if the state isn't investing in basic public services like health and education. But as you say, it's a long-term story. Did you want to say anything on that? Or?
Yeah, I would say I'm not so sure that I necessarily agree with the fact that there's not been economic growth. In the last 10 years, Africa has seen about 3.5% sustained economic growth in a time when you had global food crisis, oil crisis, or crisis in oil prices. You had the financial meltdown, and let's not forget the impacts of climate change on the ability to produce crops. The reason why you've seen that growth over the last several years is due to the MDGs, right? Not because of the MDGs, but because of the conversations that they initiated and the actions that they forced, both in terms of systems development, like the Global Fund, like Gavi, like the President's Malaria Initiative, for example. But you're also seeing, those things, the cumulative impacts of those health interventions take a couple years to catch up with the actual agricultural development, which then leads to the economic development and the economic growth. But I think what's really, really crucial to understand is that what we're seeing right now is just the tip of the iceberg. We look at China, for example, which right now is investing more money in infrastructure in Africa than all of the other OECD countries combined. That's not a small figure. Obviously, it's in part of their enlightened self-interest, but imagine what the development of pure, just connected highways and road systems is going to do for Africa's development. I think for those people in the room who've not yet been to Africa, you'll see, I mean, it's a significant barrier. Think about what mobile telephony and the expansion of a billion users in Africa in the next 5 years is going to look like. You'll have mobile banking, you'll have mobile health. That's going to drastically transform the way that services are offered and sold and commerce is conducted. That said, it all comes back down to a question of messaging and a question of optics. The UN Foundation has done some amazing polling on messaging related to the MDGs, and I think, first of all, I would encourage everyone here to take a look at it. But I think what's most important is that it's really important to frame very properly and succinctly what are the successes of the MDGs that need to be merchandised and need to be told to the policymakers, that need to be told to the investors, and that need to be told to the businesses and the individuals to get their support. The single largest fallacy with the MDGs is that it's the province of governments only to make their own, to affect change with the goals. It's absolutely not true. It's up to everyone. So I would just really encourage everyone, first of all, to take a look at the polling that UNF has put out, because it's spectacular, but also just to be very, very mindful of where we are now is not going to have any resemblance to where we'll be 5 years from now.
Great. Are you coming up for that? And while you're coming up, and have a look at Rwanda if you want to link health and the economic growth over the last 5 to 7 years. The numbers on both fronts are astounding, and there's some interesting case studies trying to link the two. Please.
My name is Mary Ellen Kevlusek. I'm from the Nightingale Mission for Global Health. As talked about at the Women Deliver Conference and the Global Health Conference back in June here, much discussion was about the drain of health workers that are being trained in developing countries and then being moved to the West because either they aren't being hired in those developing countries, they're being trained but then not hired, or the money available in the developing countries for nurses in particular is just so tantalizing that they can't help but move here. And that undermines, it seems to me, a lot of the ability to meet the Millennium Development Goals in the health area. Do you have thoughts on that and what we can do? It seems that in some ways we're undermining our own efforts by having that dynamic going on.
That's great. Do you want to?
Yeah, it's a really good question. That was a dynamic that I wasn't aware of. I think, however, in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, where more than 70% of the population lives in rural areas, the training up of community health workers is probably among the single highest priorities in terms of reducing the global health, in terms of reducing the disease burden, whether that be malaria, TB, HIV/AIDS, any other, a lot of the other infectious diseases. I'm not so certain that Stephen, our 36-year-old community health worker, is in danger of being recruited to the West anytime soon to be a nurse. That said, the single most important thing that we can do is to secure adequate financing for 10 million Stephens to be trained and spread. And frankly, I think it would be a really good problem to reach the point where we no longer need community health workers in Africa. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, though. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my best shot.
I think you're right. Community health workers are a big piece of the solution, but there's a lot that they'll never be able to do with a third education.
Right.
And the nursing level, that mid-level below physician,
right,
that really can go out and fill that gap, that's going to be a big obstacle to dealing with any but the most direct issues like malaria, things that can
Okay. So forgive me, I think I understand your question a little bit better. This is, I think, where Paul and Paul has spoken a little bit about the limitations of the MDGs as they were initially constructed, and Charles has done a masterful job at that as well. When the MDGs were constructed 5 years ago, there was a very deliberate effort to pick the low-hanging fruit. Having extreme poverty may or may not have been that low-hanging, but it was aspirational. The important thing there are a lot of important things, rather, that were left out of the mix. Any sort of Millennium Development Goal or target related to secondary education for example, was huge. But the people on the UN Millennium Project, Nancy Birdsall at CGD and Jeff Sachs and others, made a very strong determination that they had to pick their battles, and that the sequencing of primary school over secondary was important. Will there be an expansion or a more articulated focus on secondary education over the next 5 years? There should be. Will that then contribute to a more stable society and nursing corps? I hope so. But right now, again, the systems haven't yet been put in place. The conversations are starting now, which is always a good thing. And the world's attention needs to focus on these issues now that we've gotten over this first 10 years.
And Charles, just before you opine, and it'd be great to hear your views, I'd just like to add on to that there's a debate going on in this town right now in the health sector as to whether the comparative advantage of the United States is best placed trying to strengthen health systems and answer the question that you're talking about. Can we really support and incentivize the indigenous formation of health systems which can treat the crisis over the long term versus, with a limited amount of money, addressing the symptoms which we might have an ability to address in vast numbers and literally save lives. PEPFAR is a very good example of this. On the other hand, and that debate is actually going on right now, is the Global Health Initiative and its focus on country systems or the PEPFAR model in the ascendancy? Do they threaten each other? And if they complement each other, how so? So it speaks to this question. Do you have thoughts on this?
I want to run a bit with Bill's point about community health workers versus nurses. You do need nurses. Don't get anything I'm about to say. Let anything I'm about to say take away from it. But a group put together by the Lancet, which is a British medical journal, a few years ago, looked at the 10 million child deaths in developing countries, and they said 1/3 of those 10 million deaths can be prevented if we could just have universal access to or use of oral rehydration tablets, sugar and salt and water, bed nets, and breastfeeding. Now, bed nets is something that Bill's talked about, and there should be more bed nets. But it's a fairly simple thing. You don't even need to take 3 months of training in order to be able to hand out a bed net. Breastfeeding, again, reasonably straightforward, although with a 2-week-old I do appreciate that it's not as straightforward as it might be. Oral rehydration therapy, the joy of it is that parents can do it, right? With very limited training. A lot of the things, most of the things that kill kids in developing countries, and that's a lot of the mortality burden, is things that really, 3 months training might almost be too much. I'm not suggesting it should be less. But it's really simple stuff. And so when you're thinking about bang for the buck, if you will, actually you really want to be looking at approaches like community health workers first. Now, you do need nurses and you do need doctors, and I don't want to take away from that. But even there, the story's a little more complicated than one might first imagine. Michael Clemens, who's written on the Millennium Villages, we'll leave outside, but he's also written a lot of very interesting work on migration, and in particular on this issue. And one of the examples he cites is the Philippines, where you can track the uptick in the number of nurses leaving the Philippines to go abroad, with an even bigger uptick in the number of women in the Philippines deciding to go to nursing school. And one of the reasons they're going to nursing school is because they know there's a huge opportunity out the other end. But it's still left more nurses in the Philippines than there were before. So it's not a sort of simple trade-off between, it's not just a deadweight loss, if you will, when a nurse leaves a country. Not only does it encourage more people to go into nursing school, those nurses go off to the United States or the UK or wherever. They send a lot of the money they're earning back home. And that, again, has a huge development impact. So this is not to say it's not a problem. I think in some cases, and in particular some countries, it is a problem. But it's one we need to be very careful about our response to, because it's a complicated problem.
Thanks. I'm going to actually, because we're running out of time a little bit, so I see a hand here, microphone. And because we've only got about 10 minutes, can you just show me if you want to ask a question, put your hand up, and we'll see how many we've got. We've got 1, 2, 3. Sounds good. Let's take all 3 questions, and if I may, I'm going to ask you to respond to all of them together in the last 10 minutes. Please.
My name is Kristen Sykes, the Nature Conservancy. And Bill, I was interested, coming back to your initial comment not just money that's needed, but there's a lot of factors that go into improving people's quality of life. At the same time, Paul, you mentioned that the U.S.'s new development policy is a laser focus on economic growth. So I'm interested to hear a little bit more about how MDGs have promoted more systemic approach. If there are examples where instead of focusing on one MDG, there are 8, if there are more emphases across them, and what that looks like. Whether an example from a country that's doing it, a specific country, or very.
Thanks, Kristen. Great question. Please.
Hi, my name is Kate. I guess I was curious about if you think that for the people who the MDGs are aimed at helping, do you think that there is enough access or like if they're culturally relevant enough in the participation of achieving the MDGs or using them as tools?
You mean, are they sort of a northern imposed model of development on folks who haven't had a lot of say in their development? Is that the...
Well, yes, but also, do you see that as a gap? Like, you mentioned the Millennium Development Project. Do you think that's doing enough?
Okay, thanks, Kate. And
Good afternoon, David Jesse from Alliance Partners. The goals have helped us articulate better the issues and have helped us articulate an integrated approach to the work. There was a serious effort, I don't know how long back, with the poverty reduction strategy, which were developed in a good number of countries. Was another attempt. I would like to know whether you see whether we learned anything from that and how do we utilize the Millennium Development Goals. I would also like to maybe tie it to the mandate now for Feed the Future, that would be a country-based, country-led effort, that we're going to be looking for the countries to take the lead in doing that. Charles, I hear you say that you look forward to the next generation where we have country-level goals more important than global goals. Have the goals been able to invigorate maybe a re-articulation of poverty reduction strategies in many cases? If you look at that, are they feeding? Will they serve as a good basis now to feed the future planning? Is there any synergy among these things?
okay. I'm going to ask that you fold the first and third questions together a little bit in your responses, in that I think there's a commonality. Kristen's sort of asking, are we now moving towards broader systemic approaches? The other big initiative was the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness and PRSPs. They're all about answering this question. If in the end of the day, the key drivers of development are countries themselves and peoples themselves, they have to have governments that have good plans, poverty reduction strategies. They have to think systemically about the long term rather than symptomatically. How does that impact sort of the achievement of the MDGs, and how do the MDGs strengthen that if what the MDGs are about is saying, whatever you do, you better be doing this, you better get your health impacts down, you better have poverty and so on. Is there attention there? And then let's save a little bit of time at the end for Kate's question around whether these, the consultative and participatory dimensions of it. So feel free to speak to it however they framed it or how I just did.
Great, thanks.
Go ahead, and a little briefly on this.
Sure, yeah. One of the most interesting critiques that I've ever heard about the Millennium Development Goals is that they lack an accountability structure. And if you follow that logic through, the critique then falls on the fact that there's no central planning authority for any particular issue. So on the one hand, you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. When the MDGs were constructed, it was never intended to have a central planning committee. There was never any sort of expectation that this would be a top-down, top-imposed view or set of activities related to the MDGs. So instead, what you've had is because of the MDGs and the conversations that it's initiated, you've had a series of systems that have been put into place, such as on HIV/AIDS, such as on malaria. that all basically have created their own systems with their own structures, with their own funding mechanisms, with their own form of monitoring and evaluation, and even governance. At the same time, it's also exposed huge gaps in the international system about the sort of systems approaches that we don't have, but that are desperately needed. The single biggest gap that we can point to right now, as an example, is water. There is simply no systems approach or framework, or even discussion right now, for the most part, on creating a systems-based approach for water, for clean water, like we have with HIV/AIDS. This is a huge limitation. And if we want to talk about how this resonates in terms of conflict, deadly conflict, look at most of the national security challenges facing the US right now. Afghanistan, Yemen, Qatar, others. Each of these has very, very severe water shortages that will need to be addressed. And either that's going to come in the form of military presence, in terms of quelling the revolution, or it's going to come in the response of a very articulated development approach that focuses on water, as an example. So I think it's really, really important that we be very, very clear here in noticing that there are many, many things that work well with the MDGs. There are many things where improvement is further activity is definitely needed, but blaming the MDGs for the fact that the world hasn't met those MDGs is like me, because I tend to ride bicycles, blaming the bike if I don't win a bike race. You know, the logic falls apart. As you progress. So
this has taken away my favorite excuse, but anyway, Charles.
It's true.
It's true.
I just speaking briefly to this about MDGs culturally relevant. I think the world over, people want their kids to survive. They don't want mothers to die in childbirth. Not everybody is in favour of educating their kids, but by golly, the vast majority of the vast number of countries, the vast majority of people in the vast majority of countries are. I don't really think the sort of the cultural relevance test, is a big one, or is a big issue for the MDGs. I mean, one of the ways I think they were quite artfully designed is that they do speak to universals.
That's great.
Should we go to Kate's question? Or?
Well, I think in part we've started to, but
Okay.
yes, feel free if you'd like to add anything on to Kate's question, because that's partly about cultural awareness. Yeah, that's right.
I think at the end of the day, it's very easy to forget that the MDGs are not numbers. The MDGs are not about, was target 1.75 met. It's answering a much more fundamental question, and that is, does your child live or die? Does your child does your child live past the age of 3? It's a very binary question. It's a yes or no answer. So in that regard, whatever things that we can do to help articulate a framework or a system that allows for a yes answer to that question is important, and it's a conversation worth having. At no more fundamental level can that conversation be had than at the community level. So if there are conversations that are taking place in national capitals that aren't filtering down, that's a systems failure, and we need to address it. At the same time, we need to be bolstering and scaling up priorities and interventions and projects that have a community-led approach. This is a shameless plug for the Millennium Villages, by the way. So that's because that's what we do. It's not a top-down imposed approach. The single most effective programs that we see around the world have a very, very active community approach that are done in concert with national governments and receive adequate international financing. It's a very clear formula. It's a very simple formula, but all too often it's not followed.
Well, great. Thank you both, Charles. Thank you, Bill, for your elucidating comments. I think we'd all like to say a thank you to them for sticking with us. Thanks to all of you for coming and staying and for engaging. I hope the big winner from this debate is the Millennium Development Goals and the ongoing fight against poverty. So look forward to seeing you at the next one. The thing we all love about SID is that it brings together such an interesting group of people from different walks of life. So I hope to see you at the next one. Thanks again.